I was standing in my doorway on Mother's Day, wearing a dress I bought just for that night, believing my son was finally taking me out to dinner. Instead, I watched him smile past me and escort his mother-in-law to the restaurant I thought was meant for us. In that moment, I realized something far more painful than being forgotten. I had been replaced, erased, and quietly used for years without questioning it. What happened next was not a confrontation. It was a reckoning that changed everything I thought love required of me. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Grace Thompson, and I am 63 years old. I have lived in the same small one-story house at the end of a narrow lane in Portland, Oregon, for more than 20 years. 7 of those years I have lived alone. My husband, Daniel, died suddenly from a heart attack one cold autumn morning, and with him went the rhythm that had shaped my life for decades. Since then, the house has remained standing, unchanged on the outside, while everything inside me quietly shifted. The lane where I live is lined with old maple trees. In fall, their leaves spill across the pavement like scattered letters from a language no one reads anymore. Neighbors pass by during morning walks, nodding politely, always moving somewhere else. It is peaceful here, almost too peaceful. Silence settles in easily, like dust. I wake up every morning at 5:30, long before I need to. My body never learned how to sleep in after 40 years of preparing breakfast early, packing lunches, and starting days that mattered to someone else. I make coffee for one, pour it into the same mug I have always used, and sit by the window. I turn on the radio, not out of interest, but for the sound of human voices. Without it, the quiet feels too heavy. Before Daniel died, mornings were full of small movements and casual talk. He read the newspaper while I moved around the kitchen, and we complained about the weather as if it were a shared project. When he was gone, that motion simply stopped. Time did not rush in to replace it. It just slowed down. Most of my days pass in predictable loops. I clean rooms that do not get dirty. I fold towels that only I use. I walk through the neighborhood, smiling at people who mean well but do not really know me. Loneliness in suburban America does not arrive dramatically. It seeps in through routine. I have one son, Michael, though everyone calls him Mike. He is 35 and works as a real estate agent. He is married to a woman named Jenna, smart and ambitious, the kind of person who always looks like she has somewhere important to be. Mike is busy. He has always been busy since he got married. His calls are short, his visits shorter. He loves me, I tell myself. He just has a life. Mike's wife comes from a different world. Her mother, Lillian Brooks, is confident, social, well-dressed, and deeply involved in her children's lives. Family gatherings often happen at her house, where everything feels organized and intentional. I'm usually not there. Mike calls ahead of holidays to explain plans, choosing careful words to soften the fact that he will not be stopping by. I nod into the phone and say I understand. Thanksgiving dinners, for one, slowly stopped feeling strange. Christmas became a television event. I learned how to make peace with quiet celebrations. I told myself that a good mother does not complain, does not demand space in a grown child's life. Wanting attention felt selfish, so I waited. Sometimes I scroll through old photos on my phone, images of Mike as a boy running through the same house, calling my name as if it were the only safe place in the world. I wonder when I stopped being that place for him, or if I simply faded without realizing it. At night, I place my phone on the table beside the couch and glance at it more often than I need to. Most evenings, it stays dark. The house settles around me, calm and orderly, holding the echo of a life that once overflowed with purpose. I sit there telling myself that this is normal now, that this is what being a mother looks like when your child no longer needs you. And for a long time, I believed it. If you are still watching, and this opening already feels uncomfortably familiar, comment number 1 below so I know you are with me. What happened next revealed something I never expected. So let's move on to chapter 2. Early May arrived quietly in Portland, the way it always does, wrapped in light rain and cool air that lingered even after the calendar insisted it was spring. That afternoon, I was in the kitchen folding a clean dish towel I had just used, going through the familiar motions of a day that did not ask much from me. I was not thinking about anything special, certainly not about celebrations or holidays. Mother's Day was approaching, but experience had taught me not to expect change just because a date was circled on a calendar. When the phone rang and I saw Michael's name on the screen, I paused. Calls from my son were rare enough to feel slightly unreal. I wiped my hands on the towel before answering, suddenly aware of my heartbeat, as if my body understood the significance before my mind did. His voice sounded different, slower, warmer, not rushed, not distracted. He mentioned Mother's Day almost casually, as if it were just another detail, but the words landed carefully, deliberately. I listened in silence, afraid that interrupting might break something fragile. Then he told me he had already made a reservation at a restaurant downtown, a place by the river called Riverside Ember. He explained that it was a popular spot and very difficult to book, especially on Mother's Day, which was why he wanted to tell me early. He said he would pick me up at 4 in the afternoon and that I should dress nicely. For a moment after the call ended, I stayed exactly where I was, phone still in my hand, staring at the kitchen wall as if it might explain what had just happened. I replayed every word he had said, searching for any sign that I might have misunderstood, but the details were clear. The name of the restaurant, the time, the instruction to get dressed up, the promise that he would come to my house. I sat down at the kitchen table and felt something loosen inside my chest, something I had kept tight for years. Not happiness yet, but possibility. Still, fear crept in quickly behind it. I had been disappointed before, enough times to know how dangerous hope could be. I wondered if this was simply another misunderstanding waiting to happen. To steady myself, I stood up and turned off the stove, realizing I was no longer hungry. Later that evening, I walked next door to see Carol, my neighbor and closest friend. I told her about the call, about the reservation, about how Michael sounded almost like he used to when he was younger. Carol smiled widely and squeezed my hand, telling me it was about time he remembered his mother. Her reaction made the invitation feel more real, less like a story I was telling myself to feel better. That night, I went upstairs and opened my closet. Row after row of practical clothes stared back at me. I realized how long it had been since I had needed something nice to wear. Not for comfort or errands, but to be seen. I thought about who I used to be, the woman who once dressed carefully for dinners and school events, the mother who felt included in the world her child lived in. Before going to bed, I wrote the details in my small notebook. Sunday, 4 o'clock, Riverside Ember. I set my phone on the nightstand where I could see it easily, as though that would somehow keep the promise in place. As I lay there listening to the rain tap against the window, I felt a cautious warmth spread through me, balanced carefully between excitement and restraint. I told myself quietly that perhaps this time would be different. I did not yet know that this promise would mark the beginning of a reckoning I had been delaying for years, or that Mother's Day would become a date I would remember not for what I received, but for what I finally understood. If you are still here and starting to sense that something was deeply wrong long before that door opened, Comment number 2 below. The next chapter is where the first real crack appeared. Let's continue to chapter 3. Mother's Day morning arrived with a pale, hesitant light. I woke before my alarm, my stomach tight with a nervous energy I had not felt in years. The house was still, almost reverent, as if it knew the day mattered. I moved gently through my routines, careful not to rush, careful not to treat this Sunday like any other. For once, there was somewhere I was meant to go. I showered longer than usual, letting the warm water steady me. When I dressed, I chose the navy blue dress I had bought with Carol, smoothing the fabric with my palms, as if it might calm my thoughts. I kept my makeup light, my hair simple, and around my wrist I fastened the silver bracelet Daniel had given me years ago. It felt important to carry a piece of my old life with me, a reminder that I had once been cherished. Before noon, I baked a small loaf of banana bread, the way I used to when Michael was in school. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and familiar, and for a moment I allowed myself to imagine handing it to him later that evening, watching his face soften at the memory of it. I wrapped the loaf carefully and set it by my purse. By 3:45, I was ready. I sat near the front window, back straight, keys inside my bag, listening to the low hum of traffic from the main road. Every car that passed made my pulse jump. I told myself not to read meaning into minutes, not to measure hope in seconds. Still, time felt unusually slow. When the black SUV finally turned into the lane, my breath caught. I stood up quickly, smoothed my dress by instinct, then laughed quietly at myself. I moved toward the door with a smile already forming, the kind that comes from relief rather than joy. I opened the door, and the smile froze in place. Michael stood there, but he was not alone. Jenna was beside him, carefully put together as always, and just behind them was her mother, Lillian Brooks. She filled the doorway with confidence, dressed in an elegant wine-colored gown that shimmered slightly in the late afternoon light. Her posture was relaxed, practiced, as if she belonged there. She stepped forward first, her eyes traveling over me with polite curiosity. She made a brief comment about my dress, followed by a remark about how comfortable it must be for staying in. Her tone was light, but the message landed sharply and settled deep in my chest. I turned to Michael, waiting for him to correct the moment, to explain that there had been some confusion. He did not meet my eyes right away. When he did, his smile was strained, almost apologetic, as if he hoped that would be enough. He explained, gently but firmly, that the reservation was not for me. The restaurant was crowded. The table was for only 3. He spoke as though the situation were obvious, as though my expectation had been a simple misunderstanding. The words passed through me slowly. I registered them without fully reacting. For several seconds, no one said anything. Jenna shifted her weight, looking uncomfortable but silent. Lillian adjusted her shawl and glanced at her watch, the gesture both subtle and dismissive. Inside, something went very quiet. Not anger yet, not tears, just a hollow stillness, as if the space around my heart had been emptied without warning. I realized then how visible I had made my hope, how clearly it must have shown in my preparations, in my posture, in the way I opened the door. Before leaving, Michael asked if he could leave a few boxes in my garage for a while. His words were casual, efficient, slipping easily into a familiar habit. I nodded automatically, the response coming before fully conscious thought. Old patterns had a way of asserting themselves, even in moments like this. They turned and walked back to the car together. Michael opened the door for Lillian with a practiced courtesy. The engine started, the vehicle backed out, and then it was gone. I remained standing in the doorway, banana bread still warm in my hands, the afternoon air brushing against my arms. Slowly, I stepped back inside and closed the door. I did not slam it. I did not cry. I simply stood there, dressed for a celebration that had never been meant for me, understanding for the first time that this was not a misunderstanding at all. If you are still watching, and that moment at the doorway left a knot in your stomach, comment number 3 below. What followed was not an argument, but a quiet realization that changed everything. Let's move on to chapter 4. That evening, after the door had closed and the sound of the car had faded down the street, I stood in my living room without turning on the lights. The silence felt heavier than usual, pressing in from all sides. The house looked exactly the same as it had every other Sunday, yet I felt like a guest who no longer knew where anything belonged. I moved slowly, unsure what to do with my hands, with my thoughts, with the feeling sitting just below my ribs. I carried the banana bread into the kitchen and placed it in the refrigerator. I did it carefully, as if this small act of order could keep everything else from falling apart. Then I went upstairs and hung the navy dress back in the closet, smoothing it one last time before closing the door. I told myself it was better this way. I told myself misunderstandings happened. I told myself Michael had been busy, overwhelmed, thoughtless maybe, but not cruel. Those explanations were familiar, worn thin from years of use, yet I reached for them anyway. It was not until Carol knocked later that night, that I finally sat down. She came in quietly, carrying a container of ice cream and a concern she did not try to hide. I told her what had happened from beginning to end. I explained it slowly, without dramatics, as if I were describing someone else's day. Saying the events out loud made them feel heavier, more real. Carol listened without interrupting, her face tightening with every detail. She did not rush to soften the story or excuse it for me. That was when she mentioned something that shifted everything. A few weeks earlier, she had run into Michael at a charity planning meeting downtown. When someone asked how I was doing, Michael had smiled and said I was living out of state now, settled somewhere sunny, closer to people my age. It had sounded casual, almost kind. Carol had not questioned it at the time. I sat very still as she spoke. The air felt thin, as if I needed to breathe deeper to get enough of it. In that moment, the hurt took on a different shape. This was not just neglect. This was erasure. Somewhere along the way, my son had made a version of his life that was easier without me in it, and he had edited me out accordingly. After Carol left, sleep would not come. I lay in bed replaying moments that suddenly made sense. The neighbors who stopped asking about Michael, the invitations that never arrived, the way conversations shifted when I entered the room. I had thought it was age, or social drift, or my own oversensitivity. Now I understood I had been absent from the story long before I knew it. Near dawn, I got up and made coffee. The sky outside the window was pale, undecided. Instead of sitting at the table waiting for the day to begin, I opened a drawer I had not touched in years. Inside were bank statements, insurance papers, folders I had organized for emergencies that never came. I did not feel angry yet. I felt alert, as if something long asleep had opened its eyes. I was not making plans. Not yet. I was simply looking, taking note, acknowledging details I had ignored because I trusted someone else to be careful for me. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel like apologizing for existing too loudly or expecting too much. By the time the sun was fully up, I understood something clearly. Being forgotten hurt, but being erased was something else entirely, and I was no longer willing to pretend that this was enough. If you are still with me, and realizing this was never just about one dinner, comment number 4 below, because the next part is where the consequences finally surfaced, Let's continue. The days after Mother's Day passed in an unusual quiet. I did not wait for my phone to ring. I did not replay what had happened at the doorway again and again like I once would have. Instead, there was a steady seriousness in me, the kind that settles after something inside finally clicks into place. I went about my routines differently, not softer, but firmer, as if I were standing on ground I had not realized was mine. It was Wednesday evening when the calls began. The phone lit up on the kitchen counter while I was rinsing a plate. I glanced at the screen and saw Michael's name. I let it ring. Less than a minute later, it rang again. Then again. The sound felt sharp this time, insistent rather than accidental. By the fourth call, I dried my hand slowly on a towel before answering. His voice on the other end did not sound like the calm, distracted tone I had grown used to. It was rushed and uneven, filled with a strain he did not bother to mask. He asked why his cards were not working, why the account showed as closed, why no one at the bank could help him. The words came quickly, layered with expectation. He said he needed money immediately, not a small amount, a large one. He named the number, and something in my chest went still. It was the same amount I had calculated only days earlier, the total he had taken in fragments over months from the account I thought existed for safety, not convenience. That realization landed quietly but fully. This was not a sudden emergency. It was the natural consequence of habits I had allowed to grow unchecked. The difference now was that I could see them clearly. I listened until he finished speaking. I did not interrupt or rush to fill the space the way I once would have. When I answered, my voice surprised me by how even it sounded. I told him I was not sending the money. There was a long pause, followed by disbelief. He reminded me that he was my son, that he had a family, that this was just temporary. He said it was urgent, that I would be responsible if things fell apart. The familiar weight of guilt tried to settle in, pressing on old instincts, searching for the place where I used to give in. But that place was no longer available. I told him calmly that I had closed the account because it was mine. I told him I was no longer comfortable being responsible for decisions I was not involved in. I did not raise my voice or argue about the past. I simply named the present. His tone shifted then, hardening around impatience and accusation. He spoke about everything he was dealing with, everything he had at stake. He said things I knew were meant to hurt, to provoke fear in me, to regain control. Hearing them, I felt an unexpected clarity. This was not cruelty born of anger. It was panic reacting to a closed door. I ended the call myself. When I set the phone down, my hands trembled slightly, but it passed. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the quiet of the kitchen, noticing the hum of the refrigerator, the steady ticking of the clock. Nothing had exploded. The ceiling had not fallen. The world had not ended because I said no. Later, when the house had gone fully dark, I understood the significance of what had happened. The balance had shifted. I was no longer reacting. I was deciding. Whatever came next would be complicated, and there would be consequences, but they would unfold on honest ground. For the first time in years, that felt like power I was allowed to keep. After I ended the call, I stayed in the kitchen for a long time without moving. The house was quiet again, but it did not feel empty the way it usually had. My body was tired in a strange way, as if I had carried something heavy for years and finally set it down. My hands trembled slightly, then settled. I waited for the familiar wave of regret to rush in, for the thought that I had gone too far, but it never came. Instead, clarity did. I went to bed late that night and slept in short stretches, waking with thoughts that no longer ran in circles. I saw patterns I had once refused to name. Every crisis Michael had faced ended the same way, with me stepping in to soften the impact, with promises made under pressure and forgotten once the urgency passed. My help had not protected him. It had delayed his reckoning while costing me pieces of my own life. Saying no had not broken the pattern. It had only revealed it. By morning, I knew the choice I had made was not theoretical. It needed to be completed. I called the bank as soon as it opened. I confirmed that the joint account was closed fully and requested that all remaining authorizations tied to my name be removed. I asked for new passwords, stronger security, and transaction alerts for every account I owned. The process was efficient, almost mundane, but each confirmation felt like a quiet claim of ground I had abandoned long ago. When I hung up, I did not feel victorious. I felt responsible. Messages began to arrive throughout the day. I did not read them right away. I did not need to. The emotional arc was predictable. Panic shifted into pressure, pressure into accusation. Jenna's name appeared more than once, her words carefully shaped to sound reasonable, almost kind. I left them unanswered. Silence, I was learning, was sometimes the clearest boundary. Mid-afternoon, Carol stopped by with no announcement. She did not ask questions or offer advice. She sat with me at the table, drinking tea, speaking about ordinary things. Her presence reinforced something important. I was not as alone as I had believed, and I did not need to justify my decisions to be allowed support. Later, I made a list for myself. Not a letter to anyone else, just a quiet inventory of what would change. No more open access to my finances. No more long-term storage of boxes and forgotten belongings. No more rearranging my life around the possibility of a call. These were not punishments. They were conditions for my own stability. The guilt tried to return as the evening wore on. It arrived in familiar language, reminding me of sleepless nights from decades earlier, of sacrifices made without hesitation. For years, I had believed those memories obligated me to keep sacrificing, no matter the cost. That night, I understood something new. Love did not require me to vanish. I slept more deeply than I had in weeks. When I woke, the sun was already bright, and the house felt different. I made my coffee and sat at the table without checking my phone. For the first time in a long while, the quiet did not feel like waiting. It felt intentional. I knew there would be consequences. Boundaries always provoke resistance when someone has benefited from their absence. What mattered was that I did not back away from my own decision when the discomfort arrived. Choosing myself did not mean I stopped being a mother. It meant I finally acknowledged that I was a person first. If you are still watching and wondering what happens when someone who always says yes finally says no, comment number 6 below. The fallout was real, and it reshaped everything. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It arrived sharp and deliberate, heavier than anything I had known before. Days passed without a single message or missed call. At first, I told myself it was temporary, a pause while emotions cooled. But as the quiet stretched on, it revealed its true nature. This was not distance born of busyness. It was punishment. I felt it most in the small details. Conversations ended sooner when I entered a room. Familiar faces at the grocery store grew polite and distant, their smiles thinner than before. Once, while standing in line at the pharmacy, I heard my name spoken softly behind me, followed by a pause that carried more meaning than words. Whatever story was being told, it had already traveled further than I had. I did not need confirmation to understand what had happened. Michael had filled the silence with his version of events. In that version, I was not a woman setting boundaries after years of neglect. I was a mother who had turned away when her child was in trouble. That narrative was simpler. It required no history, no context, no reflection. It made him a victim and me a problem. The realization stung in a way I had not expected. I had always feared being forgotten. I had not prepared myself to be misrepresented. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, doubt crept in quietly. I wondered if I had been too rigid, too abrupt. I replayed the call, the refusal, the finality of it. For a moment, the instinct to fix things returned, that familiar urge to reach out and smooth over discomfort, even if it meant bending myself again. But the moment passed. I reminded myself of the facts, not the feelings. I remembered the doorway on Mother's Day, the casual dismissal, the years of quiet accommodation. I remembered how easily my needs had been set aside, how normal that had become for everyone but me. Responding now would not clarify the truth. It would only teach the same lesson I had just begun to unlearn. So I did nothing. Silence, when chosen deliberately, felt different than silence endured. It demanded patience, but it also created space. Into that space, small changes began to enter. I started attending a weekly discussion group at the community center, something I had always noticed but never joined. I signed up for a beginner art class, intimidated at first, then surprised by how much I looked forward to it. These were not dramatic transformations. They were ordinary steps into a life that no longer waited for permission. There were still moments of sadness, especially at night, when the house settled and memories surfaced uninvited. Grief does not vanish simply because decisions are made, but the grief had changed shape. It no longer felt like self-blame. It felt like recognition of what had been lost and what had never truly been there. One afternoon, Carol mentioned how different I seemed. Not happier exactly, but steadier, more grounded. I took that in quietly, understanding that this steadiness had grown out of discomfort rather than ease. I knew the story being told about me might persist. I could not control that. What I could control was whether I continued sacrificing my integrity to be understood. This time, I chose not to. The days moved forward slowly and steadily. Whatever came next would not be built on explanations. It would be built on how I lived and the life I allowed myself to have. The days slowly settled into a different rhythm. I no longer woke up with the instinct to check my phone or plan my hours around the possibility of being needed. Mornings became quieter, but not hollow. I made my coffee, opened the curtains, and let the light come in without feeling like I was killing time until something else began. For the first time in years, the day belonged to me before it belonged to anyone else, if it belonged to anyone at all. One afternoon, I opened the garage and looked at the boxes that still carried traces of Michael's life. Old books, folders, things that had been stored without thought, as if space in my house and time in my life were resources that would never run out. I did not feel anger as I organized them. I felt finality. I stacked everything neatly, labeling what could be donated and what could be discarded. Clearing that space felt like closing a door gently, not in bitterness, but with intention. I kept going to the art class every week. At first, I sat apart, observing more than participating. Then, gradually, I began to enjoy the quiet focus of it, the way hours could pass without my thoughts circling the same familiar questions. The other women spoke about their own lives in pieces, sharing stories that were not centered on caregiving or sacrifice. Listening to them, I realized how narrowly I had defined myself for so long, how I had measured my worth by usefulness rather than presence. The discussion group became another anchor. It was strange and freeing to introduce myself without mentioning my son at all. No one there knew me as someone's mother first. They knew me as a woman with opinions, memories, and a voice. That realization stayed with me long after those meetings ended. There were moments when the sadness returned unexpectedly. Certain songs, certain times of day, even passing a restaurant I once imagined sharing with Michael could pull at me. I did not fight that feeling anymore. Missing him did not mean I regretted my choices. It meant I was human. The difference was that I no longer used sorrow as a reason to abandon myself. I noticed the change in small, ordinary interactions. When asked for favors that felt draining, I declined without explanation. When guilt attempted to surface, it found little ground to stand on. Each time I chose honesty over obligation, the decision became easier, less dramatic. Occasionally, news reached me indirectly. I heard fragments through other people, hints that Michael was struggling in ways I could not fix for him. I did not seek details. Knowing that consequences existed was enough. Whatever lessons came from that period belonged to him, not to me. What surprised me most was the absence of longing for things to return to how they once were. I no longer dreamed of reconciliation built on pretending nothing had happened. If there was going to be a future, it would have to be something new, something real. By reclaiming space in my home, I had begun reclaiming space inside myself. I was no longer waiting at the center of someone else's life. I was standing fully in my own. If you are still here and feeling the weight of what has changed, comment number 8 below so I know you are still with me. The ending you are about to hear is not the one you might expect. Let's move toward the conclusion. It had been several weeks since I last heard anything about Michael when the doorbell rang one quiet afternoon. I was not expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered letting it go unanswered. That hesitation told me how much I had changed. I was no longer conditioned to respond immediately, no longer living in a reflex of availability. When I opened the door, I saw him standing there alone. He looked different, thinner maybe, or simply worn in a way I had not noticed before. His shoulders were slumped, not with drama, but with exhaustion. This was not the version of my son who arrived with urgency or demands. This one seemed unsure of his place on the porch, unsure even of the welcome he might receive. I stepped aside and let him come in. We sat across from each other in the living room, the same room where so much silence had once lived. There was no urgency now, no rush to fill the space between us. The balance felt even, unfamiliar, but steady. I waited, and he spoke. He told me he had lost the money, all of it. The business opportunity had collapsed completely, leaving debts behind it. There were consequences he was still trying to manage. His voice was calm, stripped of excuses. He did not ask for help. That absence mattered more than anything else he might have said. Then he apologized. Not broadly or vaguely, but carefully. He named Mother's Day. He spoke about the way he had let me stand in the doorway, the way he had chosen what was easiest instead of what was right. He acknowledged the distance, the years of neglect, the assumption that I would always be there no matter how little he offered in return. He did not defend himself. He did not ask for forgiveness. Listening to him, I felt no rush of relief or triumph. What I felt was confirmation. Confirmation that the boundary I had held had allowed something honest to surface at last. When I spoke, my voice was steady. I told him I had heard him. I told him the pain he caused had been real and lasting. I did not soften that truth for his comfort. I also told him that an apology did not erase the past, but it could change what came next if it was followed by consistency. I made my expectations clear. Respect, not obligation. Time given freely, not squeezed in when convenient. Honest presence, not gestures made to relieve guilt. These were not terms for negotiation. They were conditions for any relationship we might rebuild. He listened without interrupting. When he left, there were no dramatic promises exchanged, no declarations about the future. The door closed behind him gently, the way it had not before. I stood there for a moment, noticing how quiet the house was and how that quiet no longer frightened me. I did not know what would come next. Reconciliation, distance, something in between. I knew only that whatever relationship existed from that point forward would be built on truth, not sacrifice. That was enough. Several months passed after Michael came to my door that afternoon. Life did not transform overnight, and I did not expect it to. Change, I learned, does not announce itself loudly. It settles in quietly, becoming visible only when you realize you are no longer bracing yourself for the same pain. Michael and I remained in contact, but the nature of that contact had shifted. We spoke occasionally, sometimes over coffee, sometimes on the phone, and the conversations were shorter, more intentional. There were no assumptions anymore, no unspoken expectations. When he reached out, it was to share something real, not to unload a problem. When I responded, it was because I wanted to, not because I felt obligated. What surprised me most was not the change in him, but the change in myself. I no longer measured my days by his presence or absence. I no longer replayed conversations, searching for signs that I mattered. That desperate hunger for validation had faded, replaced by something steadier. I had learned how empty it felt to disappear in the name of love, and how powerful it felt to stop doing that. I often thought about the woman I had been before everything unraveled. She was quiet in her suffering, generous to the point of invisibility, endlessly patient in ways that cost her deeply. I did not judge that version of myself. She did what she thought love required. She believed that endurance was the same as devotion. Now I knew better. Being a mother did not mean surrendering my dignity. Loving my child did not mean abandoning myself. The boundaries I once feared would destroy our relationship had not weakened it. They had stripped it down to something honest. Whatever connection remained was no longer built on guilt, money, or sacrifice, but on choice. There were moments, of course, when the old instincts tried to resurface, when saying no still felt uncomfortable, when asking for respect felt unnatural. But each time I held my ground, it became easier. Each time I chose myself, I reinforced a truth I had spent decades forgetting. I began to notice how many women around me shared similar stories. Mothers who had learned to shrink quietly, women who confused love with the tolerance of neglect. Listening to them, I understood that my story was not unique, but that did not make it small. It made it necessary. If I could speak to them directly, I would not tell them to stop loving their children. I would tell them to stop leaving themselves behind. I would tell them that respect does not arrive as a reward for patience. It is something you claim by refusing to accept less. On a quiet morning, as sunlight filtered through my kitchen window, I sat at the table with my coffee and felt something I had not felt in years: peace. Not the fragile peace that depends on everything going right, but the deep kind that comes from knowing who you are and what you will no longer accept. The truth is, I did not lose my son when I set my boundaries. I found myself, and in doing so, I made space for any relationship in my life to exist without sacrifice as its foundation. That was what I kept when everything changed. Sometimes the deepest change does not arrive with noise or drama. It comes quietly, after disappointment has cleared the illusion and left only truth behind. This story is not about loss, but about remembering that self-respect is not selfish, and love does not require disappearance. When boundaries are set, they do not destroy relationships worth keeping. They reveal which connections are real and which were built only on sacrifice. Life moves forward when we stop waiting to be chosen and choose ourselves instead. That choice may feel lonely at first, but it often becomes the foundation for peace, dignity, and honest connection. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If it resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss future stories like this.